Jake Peterson had never believed in anything he couldn't see. Science was real. Art was beautiful. But religion? That was mythology, wrapped in stained glass and choir songs. And death? Death was just nothing. Or so he thought, until the moment his body betrayed him. It happened in a modest hotel room in Paris, hours before his flight back home. A searing, gut-wrenching pain tore through his abdomen like wildfire. He collapsed, breathless, drenched in sweat, screaming for help. The pain wasn't just physical, it felt cosmic. Like something ancient was trying to rip him out of existence. Then, everything stopped. No breath, no heartbeat, no sound, just silence. Jake's body was still on the bed, doctors shouting around it, nurses moving fast, a monitor blaring a flatline, but he wasn't in his body anymore. He was watching from above, floating, disconnected, cold, empty. Time lost all meaning. There was no fear, just confusion, until the shadows arrived. 3 of them, tall, thin, faceless. Their outlines shimmered like smoke, blurring the edges of reality. They said nothing, just gestured, beckoned, and like a moth to the flame, Jake followed. Down endless halls, deeper into pitch black. The hospital light dimmed behind him, swallowed by creeping shadows. His mind screamed something was wrong, but his feet moved anyway, as if pulled by some invisible current he couldn't resist. Then came the whispers, low, slithering, hungry, echoing from every direction. The figures changed, their stillness turned violent. Their silence broke into cruel, guttural laughs. He tried to turn back, too late. They pounced, claws, teeth, darkness that screamed. Jake was being torn apart soul first. This wasn't some dream. This was suffering outside of time. Every fear he'd ever buried crawled to the surface. Every regret, every cruel word he'd spoken, they were all weapons now. And they used them with joy. He tried to think, tried to scream, but even thought was pain. Jake was alone, shredded, empty, erased. But in that endless despair, a flicker. Not faith, not hope, just a memory, a name. He didn't believe in it, never had, but with nothing left, he forced the words out. Jesus, help me. A whisper in the dark. And then light, radiant, wrapping around him like arms. The creatures screamed and vanished. The pain stopped. He wasn't falling anymore. He was being held, loved, safe. In that moment, Jake Peterson would never be the same again. Before the darkness, before the whispers, before the pleading in the void, Jake Peterson had a very different life. He was a man of intellect, an art professor at a respected university, renowned for his lectures on realism, perspective, and history. But when it came to faith, his opinions were sharp and absolute. He was an atheist, not the uncertain kind. Jake didn't just reject religion, he ridiculed it. He'd say faith was for the weak, a crutch, a fairy tale for those too afraid to face the abyss. He'd laugh at stories of heaven, scoff at prayer, and wave off any notion of life after death. To him, death was a blank page, one you didn't write on, didn't read from, just black. The end. He wasn't cruel, but he was confident. Arrogant even. Jake lived by reason. What couldn't be studied, proven, or measured simply didn't exist. Ironically, he wasn't unfamiliar with religion. He grew up in a small town with church bells on every corner. He'd sat through Sunday school, read Bible verses in school assemblies, and watched his parents bow their heads at dinner. He even prayed once, when he lost his dog as a boy. But as he grew older, those things faded. By college, God was gone, and he didn't miss him. At 38, Jake was at the height of his career. His works were being exhibited, He was invited to speak internationally. He had a beautiful wife, a downtown apartment, and a future so solid he could almost touch it. He felt untouchable, in control, grounded in logic. It was during one of these trips, an academic tour in Europe, that his worldview would shatter forever. He had just wrapped a guest lecture in Paris. The night before his flight back home, he and his wife enjoyed a quiet dinner, talked about future plans, and returned to the hotel early. That's when the pain started. At first, he thought it was food poisoning, but within minutes, the agony became unbearable. He clutched his stomach, curled on the bed, and screamed. His wife panicked, called for help, and Jake was rushed to a local hospital. Doctors diagnosed a perforated duodenema hole in the upper small intestine, a serious, life-threatening condition. Without immediate surgery, he wouldn't survive. But they couldn't operate right away. The hospital didn't have a surgeon until the morning. Jake would have to wait. That night, everything changed. The clock on the hospital wall ticked, the lights dimmed, machines beeped quietly, and Jake drifted. His body lay on the bed, motionless, but Jake wasn't in it anymore. He was hovering just above it, confused, weightless, strangely calm. He could see everything: his pale face, his wife's trembling hands, the doctors speaking in urgent French, the nurse reaching for a phone. But he couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't feel. Then he noticed them. Figures standing in the corner of the room, 3 of them, maybe 4. He hadn't seen them come in. They weren't hospital staff. They were tall, featureless, draped in shadows that seemed to move even when they stood still. They didn't approach, not at first. They waited, watching. Then, without words, they beckoned. Jake felt drawn, pulled, not by force, but by something subtler: curiosity, trust, a strange sense of obligation. These beings, they felt familiar, almost comforting, like silent guardians, ancient sentinels whose presence soothed and unsettled at the same time. So he followed, out of the hospital room, down long corridors that no longer resembled anything built by man. The walls grew darker, the air heavier. Light bulbs flickered out as they passed. Shadows grew longer, swallowed corners whole. No one else was there. No nurses, no patients, just Jake in the shadows. He didn't question it, not yet. He felt numb, detached. The logical part of his mind tried to keep up, tried to process. Am I dead? He wondered. Is this it? He didn't feel dead, but he didn't feel alive either. As they moved deeper, the corridor twisted, turned, became less like a hospital and more like a cave. The walls grew damp, the air colder. The darkness thickened, pressing against his skin like a living thing that knew his name and wanted to claim it. Still, he followed, until they stopped, and Jake realized he couldn't see the exit, or the path they had taken. The beings turned, their outlines sharpened, no longer smooth and humanoid, but jagged, sharp, monstrous. They circled him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Then the first blow struck. Invisible hands. Claws. Something. It wasn't just physical. It was as if they tore into his very essence. He screamed, but no sound escaped. Pain rippled through him in waves foreign, cosmic pain, not like a broken bone, more like being unraveled, piece by piece. They laughed, not in joy, but in malice, a high, rasping chorus of mockery. Jake stumbled, crawled, tried to escape, but there was no floor, no direction, just blackness, and them, more joined. The shadows multiplied. Hands grabbed at him, bit into him, pulled memories from his mind, and used them against him. You wasted your life, one hissed. Coward, another spat. He was reliving every mistake, every cruel word he ever said, every betrayal, every lie. They weaponized his regrets, and he had no shield. He tried to reason, tried to fight, but there was nothing to fight with. He was naked, vulnerable, alone. They didn't just want to hurt him. They wanted to destroy him. They didn't strike all at once. They took turns, like predators savoring a kill. One would scream in his face, while another ripped into his thoughts. They devoured every scrap of dignity, every fragment of light inside him. Jake begged, silently, with every molecule of who he was. But nothing came back. No answer. No end. Just more torment. He was collapsing inward, like his soul was folding in on itself, like his very identity was being erased, bit by bit. This wasn't hell in the fire and brimstone sense. This was worse. It was absence, void, anti-being. A place where light could not survive. A vacuum where even hope disintegrated on contact. A spiritual starvation. And in that endless stretch of horror, Jake knew something. They weren't going to stop. They weren't letting him go. He didn't know how long it went on. Minutes, hours, years. Time didn't matter. It unraveled with him. He tried to think of his wife. Her face flickered, then disappeared. He clung to the memory of laughter, warmth. But even that began to fade. And that's when the despair sank in. Not the sharp kind, not panic. Something deeper, like cement in the soul. He was hopeless, done. Nothing left. And then, a flicker. Not outside, inside. Like a dying ember. A memorismal, faint. A name. Not a doctrine. Not a prayer. Just a word buried in childhood. He didn't even believe in it. But with everything stripped away, he screamed. Not with his voice, he had none left. He screamed with his soul. Jesus, help me. Everything stopped. The beings froze. Their hands recoiled. Their eyes, if they had ice widened. The darkness around him trembled. And from somewhere beyond the void came light. The light wasn't a beam or a flash. It was a presence. It didn't rush in, it unfolded, like the edge of dawn rising over the darkest night. The creatures recoiled instantly. Their snarls became shrieks. They fled scrambling, clawing, vanishing into the black like smoke in wind, and in their place came stillness. Jake floated thereof, torn and empty. Then he felt it. Warmth. Not heat, not temperature. Something deeper. Something eternal. It wrapped around him, not as fire, but as embrace. Like the arms of a parent who had waited forever for their child to come home. He felt seen, known, and for the first time since the torment began, safe. He turned, if you could call it that, in this place, and there he was. Radiant, blinding, yet gentle. A figure clothed in light. No wings, no throne. Just love. Not spoken. Not declared. Radiated. As if every fiber of Jake's soul was being told, you are loved. You are forgiven. You were never alone. And Jake broke. He didn't just cry, collapsed inward. All the guilt, all the doubt, all the disbelief melted under that gaze. Not because he was judged, but because he was known. Every moment of his life was laid bare and still. This being loved him. Jake tried to speak, to explain, to apologize, but the being silenced him with peace. Thoughts were no longer separate from feeling. Words no longer needed air. Communication was instant soul to soul. You called. The being said not with a voice, but with essence. I didn't believe, Jake answered. But you asked, came the reply, and I came. Jake tried to understand how such power, such holiness, could come for someone like him. But the being only replied with love. There was no pride, no punishment, just presence. Grace itself, infinite, overwhelming grace. Then came the motion, not walking, not flying, rising, as if the darkness had a ceiling, and the light was leading him upward through dimensions not meant for human eyes. They passed through realm-shifting colors, lights, melodies unlike anything on Earth, each one more breathtaking than the last. He felt layers of fear and ego fall away. He felt weightless, not physically, spiritually. For the first time in his life, he felt truly whole. And as they rose higher, something stirred within him. Not knowledge, but purpose. Something was about to change. Something already had. He wasn't going back the same. Jake didn't want to go back. Not because he feared Earth, but because what he'd touched, what he'd seen, was more real than anything he'd ever known. More beautiful. More complete. It was home in the deepest, truest sense. But it wasn't his time. He didn't hear words. He just knew. The light, the being, wasn't sending him away. It was sending him back. Because he had something to do. A mission to fulfill. A message to deliver. A purpose to reclaim. In a blink, or maybe the blink was years, Jake was falling. Not through space, but through weight. The light faded. The colors vanished. The music stopped. Then pain. Sharp. Crushing. Heavy. His chest convulsed. His eyes burst open. Machines screamed. Nurses yelled. His wife gasped and collapsed onto the edge of the hospital bed, crying his name. It was chaos. Alarms. Fluorescent lights. Human hands. Earth was cold compared to what he had just left. Jake Peterson had returned, but he wasn't the same man. In the following days, doctors were baffled. He survived surgery. His vitals stabilized. What should have left him bedridden for weeks passed in days. He healed faster than anyone expected. He spoke little at first, not because he didn't want to, but because words weren't enough. He didn't know how to explain what he'd seen. Not yet. But inside, something had shifted. The arrogance, the cynicism, the mocking tone gone. He didn't just believe in God. He had met him, and that knowledge haunted him more than the darkness ever had, not in fear, but in urgency. He had wasted so much time. He had scoffed at truth, laughed at grace, dismissed eternity. No more. Jake resigned from the university. He sold the apartment. He started again, from scratch. Friends called it a breakdown. Some mocked him. Others whispered about trauma, hallucinations, brain damage, or near-death confusion. Jake let them talk, because he had a story. Not a theory, not a doctrine, a truth. He studied theology, he joined the ministry, and years later, the man who once scoffed at faith stood behind pulpits across the country, telling people what darkness feels like and what light can do. Not because he read it in a book, but because he had lived it. Jake Peterson was dead, but someone reborn had taken his place. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered that void, and when he opened them, he lived like he'd been rescued, because he had. Some say Jake's story was just the product of a dying brain, a trick of chemistry in the final seconds of consciousness. But he knew better, because he'd been there. He didn't return with perfect answers or clean theology. He came back with scars and purpose. He came back knowing the veil between life and what comes after is thinner than we think, and what waits behind it is not neutral. There is darkness, but there is also light. And sometimes, the most powerful prayer isn't crafted with precision. It's the one screamed in desperation. Jake's journey wasn't about religion. It was about rescue. And maybe, just maybe, that same light is waiting for someone else. Maybe for you. The question is, will you call out before the shadows close in? Because if the void comes and it finds you unready, who will you call? Will someone answer? If Jake's story made you feel something, if it made you think, then share it, talk about it, leave a comment. And if you want to keep peeling back the veil on this strange and shadowed world, subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. This is a look behind the veil, and the light is real.